The rhythmic scrape of a wooden spoon against ceramic was the only sound in the apartment at 5:45 on a Monday morning when most of Portland still slept under its perpetual blanket of mist. Elijah Beaumont's hands moved through the breakfast ritual with the efficiency of a man who had eliminated waste from every corner of his life. 14 years in naval intelligence had wired his body to surface before any clock could claim credit. And 3 years of single fatherhood had taught him that mornings set the trajectory for everything that followed. The cereal bowl sat on the small kitchen table beside a cutting board where banana slices arranged themselves into a smile beneath his knife. 2 dark circles for eyes, a curved line for joy. The ritual had started the morning after Rachel's hands became too weak to hold utensils, and Elijah had maintained it every day since. Even after those hands went still in a hospice bed that smelled like industrial cleanser and the particular kind of defeat that settles over places where people go to stop fighting. On the wall above the microwave, a photograph held its position with the permanence of a gravestone. Rachel Beaumont at 31 years old, her skin luminous even under the flat hospital lighting. Her arms cradling a newborn Zuri against her chest with the fierce protectiveness of someone who already knew time would be measured in stolen moments rather than promised years. Pancreatic cancer, they had called it, as if giving the thing a name made it comprehensible, as if Latin syllables could contain the reality of watching someone dissolve from the inside while medical bills stacked up like accusations on the kitchen counter. The photograph had not moved since the day Elijah hung it, and he intended for it to stay exactly where it was for the rest of his life. Beside the cereal bowl, a matte black laptop sat closed, its surface reflecting nothing. The machine contained a 256-bit encrypted partition holding 6 months of preliminary Federal Accountability Office intelligence on Titan. Global Financial's vendor payment infrastructure, bank routing numbers that led to nowhere, corporate entities that existed only on paper, a web of transactions designed by someone who understood exactly where institutional oversight stopped looking and had built an empire in that blind spot. His actual contract rate with the Federal Accountability Office was $400 per hour payable upon mission completion. Until then, he bled savings at a rate of $87 per day and called it investment. The arithmetic lived in his head without dwelling there. Rent was $875 due Friday. Checking account balance as of last night was $4,116. The final hospital bill from Rachel's treatment sat in the drawer beside the refrigerator, $2,400 in red ink. That represented the difference between what insurance deemed reasonable and what it actually cost to watch someone die with dignity. 3 weeks. $7,200 gross if he worked every billable hour, minus rent and utilities and food and the cost of being a contractor who needed to look employed enough to avoid questions, but poor enough to be invisible. The math would work or it would not. Elijah had stopped believing in luck the day a Navy chaplain used the phrase God's plan to describe an IED in Kandahar that killed 3 men in his unit and left him with a ringing in his left ear that never quite went away. The bedroom door creaked open on hinges that needed oil. Zuri appeared in mismatched socks, one purple, one green, and an oversized t-shirt that had belonged to Rachel before the weight loss made all her clothes feel like costumes. 7 years old, with a gap where her left canine used to be and eyes that asked questions most adults had stopped bothering to formulate. She dragged a papier-mâché volcano across the linoleum floor, leaving a trail of green construction paper flakes that looked like radioactive snow. She climbed onto her chair and immediately inspected the banana arrangement with the gravity of a quality inspector, whose entire career depended on identifying defects before they reached the consumer. Her small fingers pushed one of the eye circles a 1/4 inch to the left, achieving some standard of facial symmetry that only she could perceive. The volcano occupied the chair beside her like an honored guest, Up close, Elijah could see the structural compromise, a vertical crack running from crater to base, where the paste had separated from the cardboard frame. The kind of failure that happened when foundational support gave way under pressure that should have been distributed across a stronger system. Elijah braided her hair while she ate his fingers, moving with precision that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with 3 years of learning what Rachel had made look effortless. He had watched YouTube tutorials at 2 in the morning, sitting on the bathroom floor with his phone propped against the sink while Zuri slept in the next room. Hair care for black girls, the algorithm had suggested, as if it knew he was a man trying to build competency out of desperation. Now his hands moved through the sections without conscious thought, muscle memory encoding love in a way that words never quite managed. "Are you fixing computers today, Dad?" Her voice carried the particular brightness of a child who had not yet learned that the world sorted people into categories and assigned value accordingly. "That's right. You're better than computers." Something in his chest tightened and released in the space of a breath. He placed 2 small banana slices above the smiley face eyes, creating eyebrows that gave the expression a look of mild surprise. Sometimes the smartest thing a person can do is let everyone else believe the simple version. Zuri considered this with a spoonful of cereal halfway to her mouth, then accepted it the way children accept weather as a fact of existence that required no further explanation. She chewed slowly, her attention drifting to the volcano. "Mrs. Ashford said some kids shouldn't work together." Elijah's hands stopped moving for exactly 2 seconds before resuming the braid. His voice, when it emerged, carried no inflection that would tell her the words had landed like a fist in his stomach. "Who's Mrs. Ashford?" "Garrett's mom. She helps at school with science projects." Zuri's spoon clinked against the bowl. "She said it where everyone could hear, but she was looking at me and Sienna." The breakfast table suddenly felt smaller, the kitchen walls closer. Elijah finished the braid and secured it with an elastic band, then knelt so their eyes were level. "Did she say it to you?" "No. She said it to Garrett, but loud." Zuri's fingers traced the crack in her volcano. "When I asked why, she didn't say anything. She just looked at me like I was supposed to know already." Silence as a weapon. The cruelest kind, because it forced the victim to fill the void with their own worst interpretations. Elijah had seen it deployed in briefing rooms and interrogation cells, and now, apparently in elementary school science prep sessions where parents volunteered their time and their toxicity in equal measure. "Did you do something wrong?" "No." He held her gaze with enough intensity that she could see he meant it with every part of himself. Some grown-ups carry fear they never learned to put down. When that happens, the fear gets heavy and they try to make other people carry it for them. That's their weight, not yours. Zuri's eyes were Rachel's eyes, the same shade of dark brown that could hold an entire weather system without letting any of it spill. She had Rachel's way of looking at people too, that steady, unflinching assessment that made strangers uncomfortable because it suggested she could see past whatever performance they were delivering. "Mama said I'm a light." The words hit him in the center of his chest where grief lived as a permanent resident. He could see Rachel saying it, could hear the exact cadence she would have used, the way she had of turning simple observations into foundational truths that a child could build a life upon. "You are." His voice came out rougher than intended. "And light doesn't ask permission to shine." Zuri tested the structural integrity of her volcano with one finger pressing gently on the damaged section. The crack widened slightly, then held. She seemed satisfied with this result. Elijah stood and moved to the counter where his contractor badge waited beside his keys. Plain gray lanyard with a laminated card that read "EAT Support," temporary in sans serif font. The badge had been engineered to communicate exactly one message. This person is technical staff, functionally invisible, no threat to anyone important. He clipped it to the breast pocket of his shirt and checked his reflection in the microwave door. Gray button-up, no tie, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The uniform of a man who earned $22 an hour and understood his place in the architecture of institutional power. The laptop went into a shoulder bag that also contained forensic imaging software capable of replicating an entire corporate database without triggering a single network alert. The kind of tool that did not exist in the inventory of legitimate IT contractors, but that the Federal Accountability Office had developed specifically for operatives who needed to move through corporate infrastructure like ghosts, mapping every transaction and data point, while the system's immune response remained dormant. He walked Zuri to the bus stop 3 blocks east, where other children gathered with the subdued energy of people facing an obligation they had not chosen. She hugged him with one arm, the other protecting the volcano from the collision of their bodies. "You'll watch my science fair, right? You promised." "I promise." The words felt like signing a contract in a language he could not read. Too many variables beyond his control. 3 weeks to expose a fraud complex enough that it had survived 6 years of audits and compliance reviews. 3 weeks to document evidence that would hold up under federal cross-examination. 3 weeks to do it all while maintaining a cover identity so shallow that any serious scrutiny would punch through it like wet paper. Zuri boarded the bus. He waited until it turned the corner and disappeared behind a building that advertised tax preparation services and payday loans with equal enthusiasm. Then he took a different bus downtown because a man earning $22 an hour did not drive to work in a vehicle that suggested otherwise. The lobby of Titan Global Financial smelled like recirculated ambition and commercial-grade carpet cleaner. 40 floors of glass and steel, and the particular kind of confidence that came from moving other people's money in ways they would never fully understand. The building's architecture communicated its values through vertical space. Executives occupied the upper floors where windows offered views of Mount Hood and the Willamette River, while support staff worked in basement levels where the only view was of fluorescent tubes and server racks that hummed like dying refrigerators. Elijah clipped his temporary contractor badge to his shirt and moved toward the elevator bank with the unhurried pace of someone who had every right to be there and no expectation that anyone would care. He had already memorized the personnel files of every senior executive, every department head, every administrative assistant who had access to the financial servers. The badge read IT Support, Contract. The laptop bag contained enough technical capability to dismantle their entire operation from the inside. The gap between appearance and reality was where he lived now. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside with a cluster of mid-level managers carrying paper coffee cups and the comfortable posture of people who had never questioned whether they belonged in the spaces they occupied. Their conversation washed over him something about quarterly projections and client retention rates. The language of an industry that had discovered you could create enormous wealth by being very good at saying things that sounded important while meaning nothing. At the 19th floor, Marcus Wilhelm entered. Head of Human Resources, 44 years old, the man responsible for filing, cataloging, and quietly burying 73 internal complaints of racial discrimination over 6 years. Elijah knew this because the Federal Accountability Office's preliminary intelligence had included Wilhelm's email archive going back to 2019, when he had first created the standardized exit interview template that made wrongful termination look like performance management. Wilhelm glanced at Elijah's badge, then at the collection of suits surrounding them. His smile deployed itself with the practiced efficiency of HR professionals who had learned to redirect problems without technically saying anything actionable. "Tech support elevators around the back. Keeps the flow organized." Elijah met his eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to acknowledge the statement without signaling deference or defiance. "My badge works here, Mr. Wilhelm. I know it does, but we have procedures. Keeps things orderly. The manager shifted slightly, creating a pocket of space around Elijah that communicated his reclassification from person to obstacle. Wilhelm's smile never wavered. The elevator continued its ascent with the hydraulic whisper of a machine that cost more than most people earned in a year. Elijah stepped out at the next floor without another word. He did not need to win this exchange. He needed Wilhelm to believe he had. The basement-level IT workstation was exactly as depressing as the federal briefing had described. Fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they were dying of something chronic. A shared desk with coffee rings baked into the laminate surface, creating a topographical map of someone else's caffeine dependency. A server rack in the corner that hummed at a frequency suggesting imminent mechanical failure. Elijah logged in with his contractor credentials. Behind the visible desktop interface, the forensic software began its silent work mapping the architecture of Titan Global's vendor payment system, one transaction at a time. The preliminary intelligence from Washington had flagged 5 invoices from a company called Quantum Logistics, all structured just under the $10,000 threshold. That required board approval. His job was not to discover. His job was to confirm, document, and build an evidentiary chain that would survive the kind of legal assault that corporations with unlimited resources could mount when their survival depended on destroying credibility. The first invoice appeared on his screen dated March 2019. Quantum Logistics, Enterprise Server Maintenance, $9,800. The vendor EIN was 472839401. Elijah opened a parallel window and ran the number through the IRS Business Entity Database. No match. The number did not exist. Quantum Logistics did not exist. Someone had fabricated an employer identification number, typed it into Titan Global's accounts payable system, and cut a check to a phantom company that existed only in the space between oversight and execution. Elijah sat back in the cheap office chair and felt something that might have been satisfaction if he allowed himself to feel anything while working. This was the foundation. This was the crack in the architecture that would let him pull the entire structure down. Now he just needed to find who built it and where the money went after it disappeared into whatever offshore void they had prepared for it. The morning dissolved into technical work. Elijah moved through Titan's financial databases with the methodical precision of someone conducting surgery on a patient who could not know they were being operated on. Transaction logs, wire transfer records, vendor registration forms that should have required documentation no one had bothered to verify. Every piece of evidence replicated and time-stamped and stored in encrypted partitions that would prove federal chain of custody when this eventually reached a courtroom. At 11:14, the entire 19th through 22nd floors lost access to their email systems. Elijah heard about it first from the IT manager, who appeared at his workstation with the harried expression of someone whose job had just become significantly more difficult. Internal databases had crashed. Shared drives were inaccessible. The quarterly compliance reports that were supposed to be submitted to the board by end of business today existed only in a digital void that no one could reach. The in-house IT manager made a phone call to an external contractor and quoted a 4-hour repair window. Elijah stood up from his basement workstation and walked upstairs without asking permission. The 21st floor smelled like panic and expensive cologne. Executives stood in hallway clusters checking their phones as if refreshing the email app would somehow override a server failure. Elijah found the terminal and logged in with administrative credentials that should not have worked but did. Because institutional security was mostly theater designed to make people feel protected while doing nothing to stop someone who understood how the machinery actually functioned. The problem revealed itself in less than 3 minutes. A cascading database conflict triggered by a poorly written automated query that had been running in the background for months without anyone noticing. The kind of error that happened when companies prioritized speed over competence and hired contractors who wrote code that worked until it didn't. Elijah fixed it in 11 minutes, but while he was inside the system repairing their mistake, he found something else. Hidden in the query architecture behind layers of conditional statements that most administrators would never bother to examine, there was a deletion command. Scheduled to execute at end of quarter. Targeted at transaction records from fiscal years 2019 through 2023. Designed to remove evidence that someone very much wanted to stop existing. He captured the command structure, copied it, encrypted it, stored it in 3 separate secure partitions that the Federal Accountability Office maintained specifically for evidence that needed to survive attempts at destruction. Then he erased his access logs and stood up from the terminal as if nothing had happened. Victoria Sterling appeared while the system was rebooting. Regional CEO, Pacific Northwest Division, 42 years old, 12 years climbing a ladder that had been specifically engineered to be steeper for her than for the men who built it. She wore authority the way some people wore perfume. Not applied, but emanating from the pores as if competence had been metabolized and was now being released as vapor. She walked directly to Elijah after the fix and said 2 words that no one else on the floor had bothered with. "Thank you." Elijah nodded. She studied him for exactly half a second longer than necessary. The kind of look that a woman in her position developed after a decade of distinguishing between people who performed competence and people who simply possessed it. Her eyes were dark and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. The kind of tired that accumulated when you spent years being excellent at something that would never love you back. Then she returned to her office, heels clicking against tile in a rhythm that suggested she had already moved on to the next problem. But Elijah could tell she had not moved on. He could tell because she paused for 1 additional second at her door and looked back before entering as if confirming something she had suspected but not yet verified. The moment passed. The floor returned to its normal operations. Elijah descended to the basement and resumed his cover as a contractor who fixed printers and reset passwords and existed in that productive invisibility that institutional spaces reserved for service labor. That evening at 9:17, Zuri asleep with her volcano standing guard on the nightstand. Elijah opened the encrypted partition and reviewed what he had collected. The forensic imaging software had completed its first full sweep of Titan Global's financial infrastructure, and the results confirmed everything Washington suspected, while revealing a scale that exceeded the original estimate by a factor of 14. Not 5 invoices from Quantum Logistics. 73 transactions across 4 shell companies over 6 years. Total capital diverted. $4,726,341 from the Portland division alone. Every wire routed through the same offshore corridor, landing in a Cayman Islands account. Registered to a holding company called Blackwell Capital LLC. The beneficial owner of that LLC was Nathaniel Blackwell, chairman of Titan Global's audit committee, the man whose signature appeared on every quarterly compliance certification for the past 6 years. The man who had publicly praised the integrity of the financial systems he was systematically hollowing out, while standing in front of shareholders and board members and regulators who trusted him because men like him had spent centuries teaching institutions to trust men like him. Elijah sat back in the kitchen chair that creaked under his weight. The refrigerator hummed its baseline note. Rain tapped against the window with the patience of something that had been falling long before anyone built walls to keep it out. He looked at Rachel's photograph, and he did not speak to her because she had never needed his words to understand what he was thinking. The evidence was devastating. The timeline was clear. And somewhere in this city, Nathaniel Blackwell was sleeping soundly in a house paid for with money stolen from the institution that trusted him to keep it safe. The mathematics of injustice had always been simple. Those with power took what they wanted, and those without power endured what they must. But mathematics had an enemy called documentation, and Elijah Beaumont had just documented enough to turn arithmetic into accountability. He closed the laptop and checked on Zuri. She was curled around a stuffed elephant that had belonged to Rachel, breathing in the slow rhythm of a child who had not yet learned that the world contained people who would look at her and see something less than miraculous. He adjusted her blanket and returned to the kitchen, where his phone displayed one missed call from Zuri's school and a voicemail from her teacher. The words were careful, the way adults spoke when they were trying to describe something ugly without using ugly language. Something had happened during science fair preparation. A parent volunteer had made comments in front of the children. The principal was requesting that Elijah come in tomorrow morning to discuss the incident. Elijah played the message twice. The teacher's voice strained around the edges as if she were trying to hold something heavy that kept threatening to slip from her grip. He set the phone on the table beside the laptop. On one screen, 73 acts of corporate fraud. On the other, a voicemail about his daughter. He had entered this assignment believing the battlefield was confined to server rooms and boardrooms. The realization that it had followed him to the hallways of his child's elementary school landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples would reach every wall of his life before this was over. And the man who set this system in motion had no idea that the person he considered invisible had already mapped every crack in its foundation and was now preparing to bring the entire structure down on his head. The school hallway the next morning smelled like hand sanitizer and construction paper and the particular kind of institutional anxiety that accumulated in places where adults made decisions about children's futures based on incomplete information and personal bias. Elijah arrived at 8:12 wearing the same gray button-up from yesterday, because the laundry cycle had not aligned with crisis schedules and he had learned that some battles were not worth fighting. Zuri sat in the principal's office on a plastic chair designed for someone half her size. Her volcano occupied her lap. The crack had widened during transport, creating a separation that ran from crater to base like a geological fault line that had finally given way under pressure that should have been distributed across a stronger foundation. She was not crying. That was the part that put weight on Elijah's chest and made breathing feel like work. She had already processed whatever happened and moved into the kind of silence that children adopted when they decided the adults around them could not be trusted to fix the thing that broke. The principal was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, who explained the situation in careful liability-conscious language that had clearly been vetted by someone in the district's legal department. A parent volunteered during yesterday's after-school science preparation. Comments made within earshot of 6 children. The specific words were not repeated in the official summary, but the principal's expression communicated that they were the kind of words that damaged people in ways that did not show up on incident reports. Zuri's teacher filled in the margins with details that policy would not allow the principal to say. The parent volunteer was Claire Ashford. She had told her son Garrett loudly enough for the entire room to hear that there were certain kids he should not be partnering with for group projects. When Zuri asked why, the woman had said nothing, just looked at her with an expression that made it clear the answer was supposed to be obvious. Zuri had worked on her volcano alone for the remaining 40 minutes while other children formed groups and shared materials and learned whatever lesson the activity was supposed to teach about collaboration and scientific method. Elijah knelt in front of his daughter. The linoleum was cold through his pant leg. Zuri looked at him with Rachel's eyes, and he saw in them the exact moment when a child began to understand that the world would not always be fair, and that some people had decided who she was before she ever opened her mouth. "Did I do something wrong, Dad?" The question arrived with the weight of genuine confusion. She was 7 years old. Her frame of reference for how humans treated each other had been built primarily from interactions with her father and her grandmother and her teachers, who tried their best within a system designed to fail children like her. She did not yet have the vocabulary to describe what had happened because the concept that someone would reject her based solely on the color of her skin existed outside the boundaries of her moral universe. No. He held her gaze with enough intensity that she could see he meant it with every part of himself. Some grown-ups carry fear they never learned to put down. When that happens, the fear gets heavy and it makes them say things that aren't true and do things that hurt people. That's their weight, not yours. Zuri considered this with the seriousness of someone receiving information that would reshape how they moved through the world. Mama said I'm a light. You are. His voice came out steady despite the thing burning in his chest. And light doesn't ask permission to shine. Zuri turned the volcano over in her hands, examining the structural damage with the clinical assessment of an engineer evaluating failure points. Elijah reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small tube of adhesive that he carried specifically because he was a man who believed in being prepared for structural failures in all their forms. He applied 2 precise lines of glue to the crack, held the volcano steady for 30 seconds while the bond set, then handed it back. Zuri tested the repair with one finger. Found it solid. The first small smile of the morning surfaced on her face like sun breaking through overcast, and for exactly 3 seconds the world felt like a place where broken things could be made whole again. Elijah dropped Zuri at her grandmother's house after the meeting. Elena Ramos was 71 years old with hands that still remembered how to braid hair and a face that carried every disappointment life had delivered without letting any of it turn into bitterness. She asked no questions when Elijah appeared on a weekday morning with a packed bag and a child who needed steadiness. Just opened the door and pulled Zuri into a hug that communicated safety without requiring language. The drive back downtown took 19 minutes. Elijah used every one of them to run the arithmetic that was starting to form a pattern he could not ignore. Claire Ashford's husband was Garrett Ashford. Garrett Ashford was a procurement manager at Titan Global Financial on the 21st floor. Garrett Ashford's email address appeared on 14 of the 73 invoices from Quantum Logistics as the secondary approval authority. The parent volunteer who had made his daughter feel invisible in her own classroom was married to a man whose signature authorized fraudulent transactions that funneled money into offshore accounts controlled by Nathaniel Blackwell. The system that was bleeding Titan Global dry was the same system that had taught Garrett Ashford's wife that she could make a 7-year-old child feel less than human and face no consequences for it. The personal and the institutional were not parallel lines. They were the same road, and every person traveling it had made a choice about which direction they wanted to face. Elijah parked 3 blocks from Titan Global and walked the rest of the way because men who earned $22 an hour did not arrive in vehicles that suggested they had resources beyond what their hourly wage could support. He entered through the back service entrance, where contractors and delivery personnel moved through institutional space without requiring acknowledgement from the people whose comfort depended on remaining unaware of how many invisible hands maintained their environment. The basement IT workstation welcomed him back with flickering fluorescent light and the persistent hum of server racks that would probably fail within the next 6 months. Elijah logged in and resumed his cover. Fixed printer drivers, reset passwords for people who had forgotten them, maintained the performance of competent invisibility that would allow him to remain exactly where he needed to be for another 2.5 weeks. At 2:47, his phone vibrated with a text from Zuri's grandmother. The message contained no words, just a photograph of Zuri at the kitchen table with colored pencils spread around her like artillery. She was drawing something that looked like a superhero figure standing between 2 buildings. Above the drawing, she had written in careful block letters, "My dad fixes everything." Elijah stared at the image for longer than was probably healthy. Then he closed his phone and returned to work because there were still 73 transactions to document and 4 shell companies to trace. And 2.5 weeks to build a case that would prove a 7-year-old girl's father could actually fix the things that were broken even when those things were so much larger than one person should have to face alone. Week 2 arrived with the weight of accumulated evidence and the quiet erosion of financial reserves that Elijah tracked in a spreadsheet he never opened because the numbers lived in his head anyway. Rent paid on Friday left $3,241 in checking. Hospital bill notice arrived Saturday morning requesting payment arrangements for the outstanding Rachel debt. Zuri needed new shoes, her current pair splitting at the seams in a way that would become obvious to other children within days. The Federal Accountability Office contract paid nothing until Mission Complete, and Mission Complete required another 12 days of maintaining a cover identity so thin that sustained scrutiny would puncture it immediately. The forensic imaging software had given him a mirror of Titan Global's entire financial architecture, and he moved through it during 90-minute blocks between his contractor shifts. Late nights after Zuri's breathing settled into the steady rhythm of sleep. Early mornings when Portland's streets were empty enough that the city felt like it belonged to him alone. The work demanded precision that bordered on obsession because one mishandled file or one careless timestamp could compromise 6 months of federal preparation and destroy the only chance 38 wrongfully terminated employees would ever have at justice. The wire transfer logs told the first story. 73 transactions over 6 years routed through 4 shell companies that existed only in the gap between institutional oversight and criminal intent. Quantum Logistics, Pinnacle Supply Group, Westmark Industrial, Cascade Technical Partners. Every entity registered in different states with fabricated employer identification numbers that returned no matches in IRS databases. Every transaction structured below the $10,000 threshold that required board approval. Every wire disappearing into the same offshore corridor that terminated at Cayman National Bank. In an account registered to Blackwell Capital, LLC. The personnel records told the second story, and this one carried a different kind of weight. 12 employees terminated over the same 6-year period, all Black or Latino, all working in departments adjacent to the vendor payment pipeline where they would have seen the invoices and routing numbers and asked questions that competent people ask when numbers stop making sense. All dismissed within 90 days of raising concerns about procurement irregularities. Every termination processed through Marcus Wilhelm with exit interviews so standardized they read like they had been copied from a template. Elijah found the template on Tuesday night. Archived in a shared HR drive created in April 2019, last modified by M. Wilhelm. The document contained pre-written paragraphs about performance deficiencies and cultural fit issues, and failure to meet expectations that could be applied to any employee regardless of their actual work quality. A bureaucratic machine designed to convert legitimate concerns into manufactured incompetence, thereby protecting the fraud while eliminating the witnesses who noticed it. He documented everything, captured screenshots with federal timestamps, cross-referenced termination dates with invoice approvals, built a timeline that showed exactly when employees started asking questions and exactly when their employment ended, and exactly how much money disappeared in the weeks immediately following their removal. The pattern was so clear that defending it would require either claiming coincidence stretched across 73 separate incidents, or admitting intentional systematic retaliation, which meant no defense existed that would survive even cursory examination. On Tuesday night of week 2, Elijah met Lorraine Chambers at a diner 4 miles from the Titan Global campus. She had contacted him through an encrypted channel the Federal Accountability Office maintained for witnesses who wanted to come forward but feared retaliation. 56 years old with gray streaking her black hair and hands that trembled slightly when she lifted her coffee cup. She carried a banker's box that she placed on the table between them like an offering she had been holding for someone worthy of receiving it. Inside the box were 3 years of evidence that Lorraine had collected after her termination in the desperate hope that someone would eventually care enough to look. Printed invoices from Quantum Logistics that she had copied before her network access was revoked. Internal email threads where Garrett Ashford approved payments for services that were never rendered. A USB drive that Lorraine held in her palm for several seconds before placing it on top of the other documents. There's a recording on here. From a departmental meeting in March 2021. I kept my phone in my lap under the table because something felt wrong about the way they were talking, about keeping certain transactions off the main ledger. Elijah took the USB drive and connected it to his laptop. The audio file was 47 minutes long. He skipped to the timestamp Lorraine indicated at minute 32. The sound quality was poor, muffled by fabric and distance, but the voice was unmistakable. Nathaniel Blackwell speaking with the casual authority of someone who believed his instructions would be followed because his instructions had always been followed. Keep the quantum transactions off the primary consolidation ledger. Route them through the subsidiary accounts where they won't trigger the automated compliance flags. We've done this for 3 years without issue, and I see no reason to change the process now. The recording continued with general discussion about quarterly targets and vendor relationships, but that 30-second segment was enough. Direct evidence of intentional concealment from the man whose signature certified that all transactions had been properly documented and reviewed. The kind of smoking gun that prosecutors built entire cases around because juries understood the difference between mistakes and deliberate acts of hiding evidence. Lorraine's hands shook harder now that the USB drive was no longer in her possession. Her coffee had gone cold, but she held the cup anyway as if it gave her something to do with fingers that wanted to move. I lost my house. The mortgage payments kept coming and unemployment only covered half my previous salary. My husband left 6 months after I was fired because he said I had become obsessed with proving I was right instead of moving on with my life. I've been blacklisted from every major accounting firm in Portland. 3 years I've been working temp positions and contract gigs that pay 30% of what I used to make. Elijah looked at her across the scratched formica surface that probably had not been cleaned properly in weeks. Her eyes carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had been right about something important while everyone around them insisted she was wrong. The kind of tired that accumulated when institutional power decided you were expendable, and every subsequent interaction confirmed that assessment. I believe you, and I'll finish this. Lorraine's breath came out in something between a laugh and a sob. She pressed her palm against her mouth for several seconds before speaking again. When I first filed the complaint about the quantum discrepancies, my supervisor told me I was making a mountain out of a molehill. When I pushed harder, he said I was being difficult. When I took it to HR, Marcus Wilhelm told me that questioning the judgment of senior leadership suggested I might not be a good fit for the company culture. 2 weeks later, I was fired for performance issues that had never been mentioned in any of my previous reviews. The story was identical to 11 others that Elijah had read in federal case files. The script never varied because the script worked. Question authority and become the problem. Push for accountability and discover that accountability only flows downward. The system protected itself by making examples of people who believed institutional policies meant what they said. Elijah called Agent Dominique Reeves that same night on a secure line that bounced through 3 relay points before connecting. Reeves worked out of the Department of Justice's white-collar crime division in Seattle, and she had been tracking the Titan Global investigation for 8 months before Elijah was brought in to gather ground-level evidence. The scope is expanding. We've identified the same phantom vendor pattern in Titan branches across Seattle, Sacramento, and Denver. Total estimated diversion across 4 states is now 14.2 million. 38 employees wrongfully terminated nationwide using the same HR template that Wilhelm created in Portland. Elijah absorbed this information while watching rain streak his apartment window. The scale had just multiplied by a factor of 3. This was no longer a regional fraud with a few $1 million in stolen assets. This was a coordinated national operation that had been running for years, while external auditors and internal compliance departments somehow missed 73 separate red flags that should have triggered immediate investigation. How long until you can coordinate multi-state warrants? 7 to 10 days. We need all 4 U.S. attorneys' offices aligned on timing, and we need to make sure every piece of evidence will hold up under the kind of legal assault that Titan's attorneys will mount. These are not people who go down quietly. Understood. I'll hold the cover. He disconnected and sat in the dark kitchen where the only light came from the laptop screen and the refrigerator's internal bulb shining through the crack in the door seal. 7 to 10 days meant another week and a half of pretending to fix printer drivers while documenting crimes that affected 38 families across 4 states. Another week and a half of watching his bank account decrease while hospital bills and rent and Zuri's shoes competed for resources that did not exist in sufficient quantity to address them all. The mathematics of undercover work were simple. You bet everything on the outcome and either won or lost completely. There was no middle ground where you could collect partial payment for partial success. Either Nathaniel Blackwell went to prison and the 38 got justice, and Elijah received his $48,000, or the operation collapsed and everyone lost except the people who always won. Because the system was designed to protect them first and serve everyone else only if resources remained after the protection was complete. Zuri called before bed, her voice carrying through the phone speaker with the particular brightness of a child who had spent the day at her grandmother's house eating homemade cookies and watching nature documentaries. Dad, Abuela showed me a video about volcanoes. Real ones in Hawaii. They're called shield volcanoes and they erupt slow instead of exploding. Elijah leaned back in the kitchen chair and let her voice fill the empty space. That sounds a lot safer than the exploding kind. Abuela said sometimes the slow changes are the ones that last. Like when lava flows, it builds new land that stays there forever. The explosions just blow everything up and then it's gone. He smiled despite everything. She was 7 years old and already understood that transformation could happen through accumulation rather than destruction. That patient, consistent pressure could reshape landscapes in ways that spectacular violence never achieved. Your abuela is a smart woman. She said you're fixing something very big, is that true? The question arrived without guile or hidden agenda, just genuine curiosity about what her father did during the hours when he was not with her. Elijah considered how to answer in a way that was honest without burdening her with details that belonged in adult spaces. I'm working on making sure some people who were treated unfairly get a chance to be heard. Like how Mrs. Ashford was unfair to me? The connection landed in his chest like a fist. She had understood more than he realized, had made the link between her own experience and the broader patterns of injustice that adults spent entire careers documenting and analyzing. 7 years old, and she already knew that the small cruelties and the large ones came from the same source. Yes, like that. Okay, I hope you win. The call ended and Elijah sat with the phone in his hand, watching the screen fade to black. Hope was a luxury he could not afford until the evidence was complete and the warrants were executed and Nathaniel Blackwell was standing in a courtroom trying to explain why his signature appeared on 6 years of fraudulent compliance certifications. But Zuri's hope mattered more than his caution, because children needed to believe their fathers could fix broken things, or the world became too heavy to carry. Wednesday morning of week 2 at 2:14 a.m. The Titan global server logs registered an unauthorized bulk deletion command. The query targeted transaction records from all 4 shell company vendor IDs across fiscal years 2019 through 2023. It required Level 3 administrative access, the kind that only 4 people in the entire organization possessed. The command executed successfully, deleting approximately 14,000 individual transaction records from the primary financial database. Elijah detected the deletion at 6:30 a.m. when he arrived at his basement workstation and ran his automated monitoring script. The forensic software had been capturing real-time snapshots of the database every 4 hours, which meant he had a complete backup of every deleted record, time-stamped and certified according to federal evidence standards. But more valuable than the recovery was the deletion command itself. He isolated the query structure, traced its origin point, identified the authentication credentials used to authorize the deletion. The login belonged to an administrative account assigned to the Office of the Audit Committee Chairman. The terminal ID corresponded to a workstation on the 40th floor. The timestamp showed the command executed at 2:14 a.m., when the building would have been empty except for overnight security who had no visibility into network activity. Nathaniel Blackwell had personally deleted 6 years of evidence, not through a subordinate, not through an automated process, not through any method that would provide plausible deniability. He had logged in with his own credentials at an hour when he believed no one would be watching, and systematically destroyed every transaction record that connected his shell companies to Titan Global's accounts payable system. The act revealed something that months of financial analysis could not: active consciousness of guilt. Blackwell knew the fraud existed, knew evidence existed, knew someone might be investigating, and instead of stopping the fraud or coming forward or attempting any legitimate response, he had chosen to destroy the evidence, thereby confirming that he understood exactly what he was doing and that what he was doing was criminal. Elijah did not just recover the deleted records, he captured the deletion command with forensic precision, documenting the exact moment when a man with 6 years of stolen wealth decided that hiding his crimes mattered more than his position or his reputation or the 38 lives he had destroyed to maintain his comfortable fiction. The deletion attempt was now evidence of obstruction and consciousness of guilt. Blackwell had not just committed fraud, he had tried to cover it up. And the cover-up was often what sent powerful men to prison when the original crime did not. At 9:47 Wednesday morning, Victoria Sterling made the unprecedented decision to visit the basement IT level. No regional CEO had set foot in the space during the 3 years since the department had been relocated to minimize its visibility to clients and executives who preferred not to think about the infrastructure that made their work possible. But Victoria walked down 4 flights of stairs in heels that were not designed for concrete and approached Elijah's workstation while he was reviewing the recovered deletion logs. She stood behind him, studying the data streams on his secondary monitor for 10 seconds before speaking. Her breathing had changed the rhythm of someone whose assumptions were being recalculated in real time. That deletion wasn't accidental. Elijah minimized the window without rushing, thereby communicating that he had nothing to hide while also establishing that the information she was viewing required context she did not yet possess. No. You recovered records that someone with executive clearance specifically tried to destroy. You resolved the corruption in 11 minutes on a contractor workstation that barely functions well enough to check email. Her voice carried the particular quality of someone who had spent 12 years learning to recognize competence in environments designed to obscure it. She was not asking for confirmation. She was testing whether Elijah would continue performing the role of temporary IT support or whether he would acknowledge that the performance had limitations. "Who are you, Mr. Beaumont?" The question hung in the fluorescent air between them. Elijah turned his chair to face her, maintaining eye contact for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to communicate that the conversation had reached borders he was not yet ready to cross. "Right now, the person who just saved your compliance audit from having a 6-year gap in its documentation." Victoria's expression did not change, but something shifted in the tension of her jaw. She had asked a direct question and received an answer that was technically responsive while avoiding the substance of what she actually wanted to know. It was the kind of evasion that confirmed suspicion rather than alleviating it. The deletion attempt came from the audit committee chair's credentials. That's what the logs show. Elijah said nothing, which means someone at the highest level of this organization is actively destroying financial records, and you somehow detected it within hours and recovered everything they tried to eliminate. Still nothing. Victoria studied him with the intensity of someone who had built a career on reading situations that other people missed. Then she turned and walked back to the stairs without another word. But she did not return to her 22nd floor office. She went to her personal workstation and spent the next 6 hours pulling server access logs and cross-referencing deletion timestamps with badge swipe records and building her own timeline of exactly what had happened at 2:14 a.m. when someone decided that evidence was more dangerous than exposure. Thursday afternoon at 2:17 p.m. Marcus Wilhelm appeared at Elijah's workstation accompanied by a security guard whose expression communicated that he was following orders he had not been given reasons for. Wilhelm carried a printed document that he held against his chest like a shield. "Your contract expires at the end of this week. We've decided not to extend. Please collect your personal effects and security will escort you out." The words arrived with practiced professional distance. Wilhelm's eyes remained fixed on a point slightly above Elijah's head, thereby avoiding direct eye contact while still communicating authority. The security guard shifted his weight, suggesting discomfort with his assigned role but insufficient conviction to question it. Elijah unplugged his laptop from the workstation. The machine was his personal property, purchased with his own money and containing nothing that belonged to Titan Global except the forensic images he had captured using software that the company did not know existed. He placed the laptop in his shoulder bag along with a coffee mug he had brought from home and a small notepad that contained only grocery lists and Zuri's school calendar. The walk from basement to lobby took 4 minutes. The security guard maintained a distance of 3 feet, communicating that Elijah was being supervised but not physically threatened. Other employees glanced at the procession, then looked away quickly because watching someone being escorted out raised questions about institutional stability that most people preferred not to ask. The lobby doors closed behind him with the pneumatic hiss of a system achieving seal. Titan Global Financial believed it had removed a problem. What it had actually done was release every piece of evidence Elijah had gathered from the constraints of internal network monitoring, thereby eliminating any possibility that Blackwell could later claim the data had been extracted through unauthorized access methods. The termination was not a setback. It was the strategic completion of exactly what Elijah needed to happen at exactly the moment when having it happen provided maximum value to the federal case. He took the bus back to his apartment and checked the mail, where a past due notice from the hospital billing department requested payment of $2,300 within 14 days, or the account would be referred to collections. His checking account contained $3,241. Rent for March was due in 6 days. The FBI payment would not arrive until Mission Complete, and Mission Complete required another 8 days minimum. On the kitchen counter, Zuri's permission slip for the science fair sat beside a crayon drawing of a volcano with the words "My dad fixes everything" written across the bottom in letters that grew progressively smaller as they approached the edge of the paper. The drawing was signed Zuri Beaumont in careful block printing with a backwards N that she had not yet learned to correct. Elijah stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at the drawing. The doubt was there, low and persistent like tinnitus that never quite resolved into slunts. He had bet his daughter's financial stability on his ability to document fraud committed by people with unlimited legal resources and institutional protection. He had bet 3 weeks of income on the assumption that the Federal Accountability Office would pay him $48,000 upon completion, and that completion would actually arrive rather than dissolving into complications and delays and bureaucratic reassessments. He had bet everything on justice, and justice had a documented history of failing to arrive for people who looked like him and his daughter. At 11:17 that night, with Zuri asleep in the next room, Elijah sat on the fire escape and opened Rachel's photograph on his phone. The image had been taken 4 months before her death, when the cancer was visible in her face, but she was still strong enough to smile at the camera and pretend that everything would somehow work out, despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. He did not speak to the photograph because she had never needed his words to understand what he was thinking. The conversation happened in silence, the way long marriages developed their own languages that operated below the threshold of speech. He showed her the doubt, and she showed him the certainty. And somewhere in that exchange, he found whatever it was that let him close the phone and open the laptop and return to work, because doubt and paralysis were not the same thing, and Elijah Beaumont had never in his life allowed them to occupy the same space. Friday evening of week 2, Elijah met Victoria Sterling at a coffee shop 6 blocks from the Titan campus. She had found his phone number through the contractor database and sent a text message that contained only an address and a time. No explanation, no request, just coordinates and a schedule that assumed he would understand why the meeting mattered. She arrived dressed in civilian clothes, dark sweater with no jewelry, and her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had been awake for most of the previous 48 hours. She carried no briefcase and no laptop, just herself and the accumulated weight of 12 years building a career in an environment that had never wanted her to succeed. Victoria placed her phone on the table between them. The screen displayed a screenshot of the deletion command executed at 2:14 a.m. Wednesday, along with the administrative credentials that authorized it. The deletion was run from Nathaniel Blackwell's account, his credentials, his terminal, his authorization. Elijah said nothing. The 4 shell companies whose records were targeted, I verified their employer identification numbers against IRS databases. None of them exist. Quantum Logistics, Pinnacle Supply, Westmark Industrial, Cascade Technical Partners, all phantom entities. She waited for acknowledgement that did not come. I signed the division transfer papers when I took this role 18 months ago. Those papers make me legally responsible for all financial activity in the Pacific Northwest Division. If this goes to audit without proper context, I'm the executive whose signature appears on the documents. I'm the one who will be held accountable for fraud I didn't commit, while the person who actually committed it walks away clean. Victoria leaned forward, her voice dropping to a register that made the air between them feel denser. That's not an accident, is it? The timing of my promotion, the transfer of liability, the sudden discovery of irregularities just after I became responsible for them. This was planned. Elijah reached into his bag and removed 2 items. The first was his federal forensic auditor credential, laminated and bearing the seal of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, along with his photograph and certification number. The second was a 2-page summary printed on plain paper with no letterhead and no classified markings. 73 transactions over 6 years. 4 shell companies routing money through Cayman National Bank to Blackwell Capital LLC. $14.2 million across 4 states. 38 employees wrongfully terminated after raising concerns. Victoria read the summary twice. The color left her face in stages like something draining through permeable stone. Her hands flattened against the table, pressing down as if the surface might tilt beneath her. Blackwell structured this so I would absorb the blame. I was never the target of the fraud. I was the target of the cover-up. Her voice, when it returned, carried the cold precision of someone who had just identified the exact shape of the trap and was already calculating the force required to break it. What do you need from me? Access to the boardroom Monday morning. Blackwell is going to call an emergency audit session to execute the frame. I need to be in that room when he does. Victoria looked at him across a table that suddenly felt too small for what had been placed on it. Her eyes moved from the credential to the summary to his face as if trying to reconcile the person sitting across from her with the contractor who had fixed printer drivers and reset passwords for 3 weeks while documenting crimes that destroyed 38 careers. You're asking me to stake 12 years of my career on a man I thought was fixing printers 3 weeks ago. I'm asking you to verify everything I just handed you and then make your own decision. You have 48 hours. Every document is independently time-stamped and federally certified. Check it all. Victoria picked up the summary and read it a third time. Then she looked at him with an expression that contained no gratitude and no admiration and no softness. Only the recognition that competence was meeting competence across a space too narrow for deception, and what happened next would determine whether 12 years of her life had been spent building something real or serving as a prop in someone else's criminal enterprise. Monday, 8 a.m. I'll have your name on the access list. The weekend passed with the weight of impending confrontation settling over Elijah's apartment like weather that could be felt but not yet seen. Saturday, he took Zuri to the park where she demonstrated her repaired volcano to other children with the unself-conscious pride of someone who had overcome structural failure through careful engineering. Sunday morning, they made pancakes together while rain tapped against the kitchen window, and she asked questions about chemical reactions that he answered with the precision of someone who believed children deserved honest explanations, even when simple ones would suffice. Victoria spent those same 48 hours in her home office pulling every document Elijah had provided through verification processes that would have impressed federal auditors. She cross-referenced EIN numbers against tax databases, traced wire routing codes through international banking archives, confirmed deletion timestamps against server access logs, built her own timeline that mapped employee terminations against procurement approvals, and discovered that the pattern was even clearer than Elijah's summary suggested. By Sunday evening, she had verified every claim and understood that the trap had been set long before she arrived. Monday morning at 8:03. The 40th floor conference room of Titan Global Financial smelled like fresh coffee and the particular brand of anxiety that accumulated when powerful people gathered to witness someone else's professional destruction. The space was all glass and polished surfaces with views of Mount Hood that served as visual confirmation of how high you had climbed and how far you could fall if institutional protection was withdrawn. Nathaniel Blackwell sat at the head of the mahogany table with the relaxed posture of someone who believed the outcome had been predetermined. 61 years old with silver hair that suggested distinguished competence and hands that had signed compliance certifications for 6 years, while systematically looting the institution he was sworn to protect. 5 audit committee members flanked him in leather chairs arranged to communicate that this was a formal proceeding rather than an informal conversation. Marcus Wilhelm occupied a position near the window, his leg bouncing at a frequency that suggested his confidence was thinner than his expression indicated. The company's general counsel sat at the far end of the table with a legal pad and an uncapped pen already positioned for note-taking. The air carried tension that preceded verdicts and terminations and career endings that everyone present could sense approaching. Victoria entered at 8:07 wearing a charcoal suit that communicated she understood the formality of what was about to happen and had dressed accordingly. Her stride carried the accumulated authority of 12 years, proving competence in spaces designed to reject it. She took the seat opposite Blackwell, establishing a geometry that made the 20 feet of mahogany between them feel like a battlefield, where only one person would walk away intact. Blackwell opened with measured warmth that had been practiced in front of mirrors and refined through decades of board presentations. Thank you all for convening on short notice. The audit committee has identified significant irregularities in the Pacific Northwest Division's vendor payment records. Given the severity of these findings, we felt it necessary to address them directly with the division's current leadership. His eyes moved to Victoria with the precision of someone executing a script. The implication arrived without subtlety. This meeting was about her failures, and everyone present would witness her accountability for problems she inherited but could not explain. Victoria met his gaze without flinching. Before we proceed, I've invited an independent systems consultant to present a forensic analysis that's directly relevant to the committee's concerns. His findings will provide necessary context for this discussion. She gestured toward the conference room door that opened on cue as if the timing had been choreographed. Elijah Beaumont entered carrying his laptop in a calm that belonged to someone who had spent 3 weeks building toward this exact moment. He wore a pressed white shirt with no tie, and his federal forensic auditor credential hung from a lanyard where the temporary IT contractor badge used to be. The credential caught light as he moved, displaying the seal of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners and a certification number that could be verified through federal databases. He crossed to the empty chair beside the presentation screen and opened his laptop with unhurried precision that communicated he had organized this moment down to the paragraph and was now simply executing a plan that had already succeeded in every way that mattered. Blackwell's recognition was immediate. The micro-expression lasted less than a second, confusion dissolving into something colder, before his boardroom composure reasserted control. This is the IT contractor whose engagement was terminated last week. He has no standing in this proceeding. Elijah's voice, when it emerged, filled the room at a register that made the air feel heavier. My name is Elijah Beaumont. I hold advanced certification from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and I was engaged by the Federal Accountability Office under Title 42, Section 1983 to conduct a covert forensic audit of Titan Global's vendor payment infrastructure. The IT credentials were operational cover. My standing in this proceeding is established by federal authority, not by your HR department. The silence that followed had physical texture, like atmospheric pressure changing before thunder arrives. 2 committee members exchanged glances that communicated they had just realized this meeting was not going to follow the expected script. The general counsel's pen stopped moving mid-word. Elijah turned his laptop toward the projection screen where the first slide appeared with the clinical precision of evidence that had been documented according to federal standards. Quantum Logistics, Employer Identification Number 47-2839401. This number does not exist in the Internal Revenue Service Registry. Quantum Logistics is a phantom entity fabricated to receive wire transfers from Titan Global's operating budget. He advanced to the next slides without pausing for reaction. Each image contained transaction records that had been recovered, time-stamped, and certified. Wire transfers routing through accounts that led nowhere. Purchase orders for services never rendered. An architecture of theft that had operated in plain sight while external auditors signed off on compliance and internal controls were praised as industry-leading. 73 transactions over 6 years, each structured below the $10,000 threshold that requires board approval. Total value, $4,726,341 from the Portland division alone. All payments routed through Cayman National Bank to an account registered to Blackwell Capital LLC. The room's oxygen supply seemed to decrease with each slide. Committee members leaned forward, studying the screen as if proximity would reveal some alternative explanation that would make the numbers mean something other than what they obviously meant. The beneficial owner of Blackwell Capital LLC is Nathaniel Thomas Blackwell, currently seated at the head of this table. Blackwell's hand moved to the table's edge, gripping the polished wood with enough force that his knuckles went pale. This is fabricated evidence. There's no verified chain of custody for any of these documents. Elijah lowered his voice, forcing everyone in the room to lean closer, thereby creating the impression that he was sharing information rather than delivering accusations. Every file carries a certified digital forensic timestamp issued by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. Challenging my seal means challenging the federal regulatory body that issued it. I would advise your counsel to consider carefully before pursuing that line of defense. The general counsel placed his pen on the legal pad and folded his hands in a posture that suggested he had just recognized the difference between defendable positions and indefensible ones. Elijah advanced to the next slide, which displayed an audio waveform with timestamps and speaker identification labels. Audio recording from a departmental meeting held March 14, 2021. The recording was provided by Lorraine Chambers, a former senior accountant who was terminated 90 days after submitting a written inquiry about procurement irregularities related to quantum logistics. He pressed play. The conference room speakers delivered Nathaniel Blackwell's voice with tinny clarity that somehow made the words more damning than professional audio quality would have achieved. Keep the quantum transactions off the primary consolidation ledger. Route them through the subsidiary accounts where they won't trigger the automated compliance flags. The voice was unmistakable. The instruction was explicit. The intent was clear. 3 committee members turned to look at their chairman simultaneously, as if choreographed movement could somehow process information that individual comprehension could not handle. Blackwell's face had gone through several colors, settling finally on a pallor that suggested his body was redirecting blood flow to vital organs because the extremities no longer required defense. Elijah continued without acknowledging the reaction. This fraud is not confined to the Portland division. Identical phantom vendor structures have been identified in Titan Global branches in Seattle, Sacramento, and Denver. Total capital diversion across 4 states is $14.2 million. The same routing patterns, the same shell companies, the same offshore destination accounts. He paused, letting the scale settle over the room like ash from a distant eruption. 38 employees were wrongfully terminated nationwide after raising concerns about these transactions. All 38 were processed through the same HR template created by Marcus Wilhelm in April 2019. Every termination occurred within 90 days of the employee questioning procurement irregularities. The pattern is consistent across all 4 cities. Wilhelm's legs stopped bouncing. His face had achieved a shade that suggested he understood his role in this proceeding had just shifted from witness to co-defendant. The Department of Justice executed multi-state search warrants this morning at 6 a.m. Pacific Time. Federal agents are currently securing records from all 4 regional offices. The conference room door opened for the second time. 2 federal agents entered wearing dark suits and expressions that communicated they had performed this ritual enough times to have eliminated any unnecessary emotion from the process. One agent carried a folder. The other carried handcuffs that hung from his belt with the casual visibility of tools that would be needed shortly. Blackwell stood so abruptly that his chair rolled backward and collided with the glass wall. The sound was sharp enough to make one committee member flinch, but most people in the room had already processed too much information to react to additional stimuli. His face had moved through anger and denial and was now arriving at the pale territory that people occupied when they watched their own carefully constructed architecture collapse in real time. Elijah looked directly at him. There was no satisfaction in the expression. No vindication performed for an audience. Just the steady gaze of someone who had documented reality and was now presenting it to people who had preferred comfortable fictions. Mr. Blackwell, I am not here because I hate you. I am here because 38 people lost their jobs for telling the truth, and every one of them deserved someone who would finish what they started. The first agent moved forward, producing handcuffs that closed around Nathaniel Blackwell's wrists with mechanical precision. The sound of metal securing against metal was surprisingly quiet given the magnitude of what it represented. 6 years of fraud ending in a conference room while morning light came through floor-to-ceiling windows. And Mount Hood watched from the distance like a witness that had seen everything and would outlast everyone. Marcus Wilhelm raised his hand before the second agent reached his position. "I want a lawyer." The words came out thin and frightened. The agent nodded and produced a second set of handcuffs that Wilhelm accepted with the resignation of someone who understood that cooperation might improve his situation marginally, but would not fundamentally alter the trajectory he was now traveling. Victoria stood at her end of the table. Her eyes were red in a way that suggested she had not slept properly in days, but her posture remained vertical and her voice when she addressed the remaining committee members carried absolute authority. "The board will receive the complete forensic report by end of business today. I expect formal clearance of all allegations against the Pacific Northwest Division by Wednesday morning. Are there questions?" The silence that followed was not uncertainty but rather the collective recognition that asking questions would require admitting how thoroughly they had failed in their oversight responsibilities. The committee members had signed off on audits and compliance certifications for 6 years without noticing that their chairman was systematically looting the institution. Questions would only highlight their complicity through negligence. There were no questions. The agents escorted Blackwell and Wilhelm from the conference room. Their footsteps receded down the hallway toward elevators that would take them to ground level where federal vehicles waited to transport them to facilities designed for people who had violated institutional trust in quantifiable ways. The committee members gathered their materials and departed with expressions suggesting they were already calculating how to explain their lack of oversight to regulators and shareholders, and the media organizations that would want to know how $14.2 million disappeared, while independent auditors certified that all financial controls were operating effectively. Victoria and Elijah remained in the conference room after everyone else had left. The silence between them was different now, lacking the tension of uncertainty that had characterized their previous interactions. She walked to the window and looked out at Portland stretching below them, washed clean by overnight rain. "You did it." "We did it. You trusted someone when institutional wisdom said you should have protected yourself first." Victoria turned from the window. "I trusted because you never asked me to. You just presented evidence and let me verify it independently. That's not how people usually operate when they want something from you." Her voice carried exhaustion and relief in equal measure. 12 years of building a career in environments designed to reject her, and now she was standing in a conference room where she had just watched the person who tried to destroy her get arrested instead. The mathematics of justice were supposed to be more complicated than this. Victories were supposed to require moral compromise and strategic calculation. But sometimes the truth was simply true, and presenting it clearly was enough. The weeks that followed moved with the momentum of institutional correction. Blackwell and Wilhelm were indicted on federal fraud charges and civil rights violations that carried potential sentences measured in decades rather than years. The Department of Justice expanded its investigation across all 4 cities, coordinating with U.S. attorneys' offices that normally competed for high-profile cases, but recognized that this one required cooperation to achieve maximum impact. The 38 wrongful termination cases were reopened with federal backing that transformed them from individual employment disputes into evidence of systematic retaliation. Most cases settled within 60 days with compensation packages that included back pay, legal fees, and formal letters of apology signed by Titan Global's new board chairman, who had been installed specifically to clean up the institutional failures that made the fraud possible. Lorraine Chambers received her settlement on a Tuesday afternoon. The check arrived by courier along with a letter printed on Titan Global letterhead, acknowledging that her termination had been unjust and her concerns about procurement irregularities had been legitimate. She called Elijah that evening, and for the first 30 seconds of the call, she could not speak. When her voice finally emerged, it carried 3 years of vindication compressed into a single breath. I framed the letter. It's hanging in my office now. Elijah understood what she meant. The money mattered because money always mattered when you had lost your house and your marriage and your career trajectory. But the letter mattered more because it was institutional acknowledgement that she had been right when everyone with power had insisted she was wrong. The letter transformed her from a problem employee who could not accept feedback into a whistleblower who had been punished for telling the truth. You earned it. You kept evidence for 3 years when most people would have given up. I kept it because I couldn't let them win, not when I knew what they did. 6 weeks after the boardroom confrontation, Lorraine opened an independent accounting practice in a small office that overlooked the Willamette River. She hired her first employee in month 2 and her third employee in month 5. The practice specialized in forensic accounting for small businesses that suspected internal fraud but lacked resources to hire the large firms that typically handled such work. She named the practice Chambers and Associates even though the associates were hypothetical for the first 3 months, because she believed in growing into titles rather than waiting for permission to claim them. Victoria implemented policy changes that bypassed the internal systems which had failed so completely. All discrimination complaints now routed to independent third-party reviewers, who had no financial relationship with Titan Global and therefore no incentive to protect the institution at the expense of individual employees. All vendor payments above $5,000 required dual approval from separate departments with no reporting relationship to each other. All compliance certifications included personal liability clauses that made executives financially responsible for fraud that occurred under their oversight. The National Board adopted Victoria's framework within 90 days and implemented it across all regional divisions. The changes would not prevent every future fraud, but they established structural obstacles that made systematic theft significantly more difficult than it had been when institutional trust operated as an unexamined assumption. Agent Dominique Reeves called Elijah on a Tuesday evening 6 weeks after the arrests to inform him that the investigative methodology he had developed was being incorporated as a case study in the FBI's white-collar crime training program. The combination of technical forensics and human intelligence gathering had produced results that exceeded what either approach achieved independently. Future federal auditors would study how he had maintained cover while documenting evidence and built relationships with witnesses who had been too frightened to come forward until someone demonstrated they were willing to listen. Elijah thanked her and returned to helping Zuri with her math homework. Long division on graph paper with a pencil that needed sharpening. She approached the problems with the same methodical precision she had applied to her volcano project, breaking complex operations into smaller steps that could be verified before moving forward. He sat beside her at the kitchen table that no longer needed to hold federal evidence and provided guidance when she asked, but mostly just watched her work through problems independently. The Federal Accountability Office payment arrived 8 weeks after the boardroom confrontation. $48,000 deposited electronically into the checking account that had dropped below $1,000 during the final week of the operation. Elijah paid the outstanding hospital bill that afternoon, bought Zuri new shoes that fit properly, paid March and April rent in advance, set aside money for Zuri's college fund that existed as a line item in a spreadsheet he updated monthly even though the amounts were small enough that compound interest would not transform them into sufficient resources for private university tuition. The arithmetic worked differently now, not comfortable but sustainable, not secure but no longer desperate. The difference between those states was larger than the dollar amount suggested because desperation created its own costs that could not be calculated on spreadsheets. 1 year after the arrests on a Sunday morning in October, Elijah and Zuri moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a better section of East Portland. Not a penthouse and not a transformation into wealth, Just one additional room with a window that overlooked a park where children played on equipment that met current safety standards. A kitchen large enough for a table that could accommodate 3 people. A neighborhood where the schools had adequate funding and the crime rate was low enough that parents let their children play outside without constant supervision. Rachel's photograph occupied the same position it always had, centered on the wall above the kitchen counter. The location had not changed because Elijah intended for her presence to remain constant even as other elements of their lives evolved. Flanking the photograph now were a Department of Justice commendation letter signed by the Assistant Attorney General in Zuri's crayon drawing that still proclaimed "My Dad fixes everything," in letters that had grown more confident over the past year but retained their essential character. Zuri burst through the apartment door on Sunday afternoon carrying a blue ribbon and a volcano that glowed red from internal LED circuits she had installed with her grandmother's help. First place in the regional science fair. The judges had praised her understanding of chemical reactions and the clarity of her presentation, and the way she had incorporated structural failure analysis into her project design. Elijah lifted her off the ground in a movement that had become ritual over 7 years. She laughed with the unself-conscious joy of a child who had been given evidence that her work mattered, and that the adults around her paid attention to what she created. The laugh was Rachel's laugh, preserved in their daughter like genetic memory that transcended death. The doorbell rang while Zuri was explaining her enhanced lava simulation technique for the 3rd time. Elijah opened the door to find Victoria standing in the hallway holding a bakery box and dressed in clothes that had nothing to do with corporate environments. Soft sweater in dark blue, hair loose rather than pulled back, the executive architecture set aside for a Sunday afternoon where titles and hierarchies did not apply. "I heard there was a science fair champion in this building." Zuri pulled her inside by the hand, already narrating the chemical formula she had developed for realistic lava consistency. Victoria listened with the attention of someone who had learned that children's explanations often contained insights that adults missed when they stopped paying attention to details that seemed insignificant. Elijah poured coffee black with no sugar and placed it in front of Victoria without asking how she took it. She picked up the cup without thanking him. They had passed the point where such gestures required acknowledgement because the gestures had become part of a shared language that operated below the threshold of explicit communication. Later, while Zuri demonstrated her LED circuit system, for the 4th time Elijah and Victoria stood on the small balcony that overlooked the park. Portland stretched below them with Mount Hood visible in the distance when the clouds permitted. The morning after rain, when the city looked like it was trying to start over with clean streets and clear air, and the possibility that today might be different from yesterday. 12 of the 38 have found new positions. Lorraine's firm hired its 5th employee last month. The policy changes we implemented are being studied by 3 other financial institutions as potential models for their own compliance frameworks. Victoria's voice was quiet and factual. She was reporting outcomes rather than claiming credit because she had learned from Elijah that competence did not require performance and results spoke more clearly than self-promotion ever could. Good. You never take credit for any of this. Because it's not mine to take. I organized evidence, but they endured 6 years before I arrived. The courage was theirs. I just made sure it led somewhere instead of disappearing into institutional silence. Victoria reached across the small distance between them and placed her hand on his. Not a grasp, but an offering, open and deliberate, giving him the choice to accept or decline without pressure or expectation. Her palm was warm against his knuckles. Elijah turned his palm upward. Her fingers settled into the spaces between his with a fit that felt both intentional and inevitable. The contact was firm without being possessive. The kind of touch between 2 people who had built trust through accumulated work done honestly in rooms where no one was watching, and therefore the work had to be real rather than performed. From inside the apartment, Zuri's voice carried through the open door. "Dad, Victoria, The volcano's about to erupt again. They both smiled and stepped back inside where the morning was continuing in ordinary, unremarkable ways that the best mornings do. Coffee cooling in ceramic mugs, laughter from a child who was demonstrating mastery of scientific principles. Sunlight coming through windows that overlooked a park where other families were gathering for Sunday routines that would never make headlines but constituted the actual fabric of lives worth living. The afternoon dissolved into the kind of domestic rhythm that Elijah had not experienced since Rachel's illness made every interaction feel weighted with impending loss. Lunch prepared together with Zuri assigned tasks that matched her capabilities. Dishes washed and dried while discussing whether volcanoes or earthquakes represented more significant geological forces. A walk to the park where Zuri played on equipment while Elijah and Victoria sat on a bench and watched her navigate structures designed to challenge children her age. She's remarkable, the way she processes information and asks questions that most adults wouldn't think to formulate. Victoria's observation carried genuine admiration rather than the performative praise that adults often deployed when discussing other people's children. She gets that from Rachel, the curiosity and the precision. I just try to make sure she has space to develop it without interference. You're doing more than providing space. You're teaching her that competence matters and that telling the truth has value even when truth-telling carries costs. Elijah watched Zuri climb a ladder that led to a slide platform. She moved with careful deliberation, testing each rung before committing her weight. The approach was characteristic of how she engaged with challenges, methodical assessment followed by confident execution once the risks had been evaluated. She shouldn't have to learn that lesson at 7, but the world doesn't wait until you're ready to teach you what it's actually like. Victoria's hand found his again without ceremony. They sat in silence while children played and autumn sunlight filtered through trees that were beginning to lose their leaves in preparation for winter. The silence was comfortable rather than awkward because neither of them felt obligated to fill empty air with words that added nothing meaningful. Evening arrived with the gradual dimming that characterized October in the Pacific Northwest. They returned to the apartment where Zuri requested that Victoria stay for dinner with the direct simplicity of a child, who had not yet learned that such invitations might be complicated by adult considerations. Victoria agreed without hesitation and helped prepare pasta while Zuri set the table with a precision that suggested she understood this meal represented something more significant than standard nutritional intake. The dinner conversation ranged across topics that included regional volcanic activity, the chemistry of pasta cooking, and whether dinosaurs would have developed advanced civilizations if the asteroid had missed Earth. Zuri dominated the discussion with theories that combined scientific knowledge and imaginative speculation in proportions that made distinguishing between them difficult. Victoria engaged with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she was actually listening rather than performing adult patience. After dinner, while Zuri brushed her teeth, Victoria stood in the kitchen looking at Rachel's photograph. She's still present here, not as a ghost but as a foundation. Elijah dried the final dish and placed it in the cabinet. She built most of what matters in this apartment, the routines and the values and the way Zuri thinks about the world. I'm just maintaining what Rachel started and trying not to damage it through incompetence. That's not maintenance. That's continuation with honor. There's a difference. Zuri emerged from the bathroom and requested that Victoria read her bedtime story. The request arrived without self-consciousness, as if having Victoria perform this ritual was the most natural progression in the world. Victoria glanced at Elijah, who nodded consent, then followed Zuri to her bedroom where books were stacked on a shelf, organized by subject matter rather than alphabetically. Elijah cleaned the kitchen while their voices carried through the apartment. Victoria read with appropriate character voices and dramatic pauses that made Zuri giggle. The sound was pure in a way that made Elijah's chest feel simultaneously full and hollow. Rachel used to read bedtime stories with similar theatrical commitment and hearing. Another woman performed that role in her absence felt like betrayal and progress in equal measure. When Victoria emerged 20 minutes later, her expression suggested she understood the weight of what had just happened. She asked if I was going to be here tomorrow. What did you say? I said I hoped so, but that life doesn't always give us certainty about tomorrow. She said that's okay because hoping is enough for now. Elijah absorbed this information while putting away the final dish. 7 years old, and Zuri already understood that hope and certainty were different categories and that accepting hope without demanding guarantees was sometimes the mature response. She's been alone with me for 3 years. Having another adult in her life who isn't her grandmother represents a change she's been wanting without knowing how to ask for it. Victoria moved closer, not invading his space, but reducing the distance enough that conversation could happen at a lower volume. What about you? What do you want? The question was direct in a way that required honest response. Elijah turned to face her, finding that she was closer than he had realized. I want someone who understands that Rachel isn't competition, that what we built before doesn't diminish what might be possible now. I want someone who sees Zuri as a person rather than an obstacle. And I want someone who knows that I'm going to make mistakes because I've been doing this alone and I don't have a manual for how to let someone else in. Victoria's eyes held his without wavering. I can work with those parameters. The kiss when it happened was careful and deliberate, not passionate in the way that movies suggested first kisses should be, but rather exploratory in the way that two competent people approach something important that required attention to detail. It lasted approximately 5 seconds before they separated and evaluated whether the experiment had produced results worth pursuing. That was nice. It was adequate with potential for improvement through practice. Elijah almost smiled. Victoria's ability to apply professional assessment frameworks to personal interactions was simultaneously absurd and endearing. I should probably go. It's late and you have work tomorrow. I have work too. New policy implementation across 3 departments. They moved toward the door with the awkward choreography of people navigating a situation that did not yet have established protocols. At the threshold, Victoria turned back. I meant what I said about hoping this continues. You and Zuri have become important to me in ways I didn't anticipate when I walked down to that basement IT station. You became important to us too. Different ways for different reasons, but important nonetheless. She left and Elijah stood in the doorway watching her walk down the hallway toward the elevator. When she reached the end, she turned and waved once before disappearing around the corner. He closed the door and returned to the kitchen where Rachel's photograph maintained its position above the counter. She's good for us. I think you'd approve. He did not expect an answer because he had never believed that consciousness persisted after biological death in forms that could communicate with the living. But saying the words aloud made them feel more real, as if verbal articulation transformed private thoughts into commitments that required follow-through. The months that followed established patterns that gradually calcified into routines. Victoria integrated herself into Elijah and Zuri's life with the steady accumulation that characterized geological processes rather than dramatic transformations. Sunday dinners became standard. Wednesday evenings she attended Zuri's science club presentations. Saturday mornings, the 3 of them explored Portland's parks and museums and bookstores that specialized in children's literature. The relationship developed without urgency because both Elijah and Victoria understood that building something durable required patience and attention to foundation rather than rushing toward outcomes that looked impressive but lacked structural integrity. They moved in together 14 months after the first kiss. Not because external pressure demanded it, but because the logistics of maintaining two households had become inefficient and Zuri had started asking why Victoria went home at night if she was just going to come back the next morning. 2 years after the arrests, Nathaniel Blackwell was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Marcus Wilhelm received 8 years. The sentences were longer than typical white-collar cases because the judge determined that the systematic termination of employees who raised concerns constituted obstruction that warranted enhancement under federal sentencing guidelines. 38 people attended the sentencing hearing. Lorraine sat in the front row, and when the sentence was announced, she closed her eyes for several seconds as if she needed to verify that the moment was real before allowing herself to feel it. Elijah did not attend the sentencing. He was at Zuri's school for parent-teacher conferences where her instructor reported that she was performing 3 grade levels above her peers in science and mathematics and demonstrated unusual ability to synthesize information from multiple sources. The teacher suggested accelerated placement, but Elijah declined because Zuri needed social development with age-appropriate peers. More than she needed additional academic challenges that would isolate her from children who might become friends. The evening of the sentencing, Victoria came home and reported the outcome. Elijah nodded and returned to helping Zuri build a model of the solar system using foam balls and wire that he had purchased from a craft store. Justice had been served in the way that institutions defined service. But the real victory was that 38 people had been vindicated and policy changes had been implemented, and future frauds would be marginally more difficult because someone had documented how this one succeeded for 6 years. 3 years after the arrests, on a morning that felt identical to hundreds of other mornings, Elijah woke to find Victoria already awake beside him, reading a report on her tablet. Sunlight came through curtains that filtered it into something superer than the original intensity. He could hear Zuri in the kitchen preparing her own breakfast, with the independence of a 10-year-old who had been taught that competence meant handling age-appropriate tasks without requiring adult supervision. The board approved another policy change yesterday. All compliance officers now report directly to independent directors rather than to executives whose compensation depends on financial performance. Elijah processed this information while emerging from sleep. That's structural. Can't be undone easily when attention shifts to other priorities. That's what I argued when I proposed it. Changes that depend on continued vigilance don't survive leadership transitions. Changes that alter incentive structures persist because they become the path of least resistance. They lay in comfortable silence while morning sounds filtered through the apartment. Zuri singing to herself in the kitchen, traffic noise from the street below, a neighbor's dog barking at something that probably did not warrant alarm, but triggered canine protocols for threat assessment. I never thanked you properly for trusting me when institutional wisdom said you should have protected yourself first. Victoria set her tablet aside. You never asked me to trust you. You presented evidence and let me verify it independently. That's not how people operate when they're running a con. That's how people operate when they're telling the truth and confident that truth can survive examination. Still, you took a risk. We both took risks. You bet 3 weeks of income and your professional reputation on the assumption that federal authorities would actually prosecute. I bet 12 years of career building on the assumption that a man I thought was fixing printers was actually who he claimed to be. We were both right. That's not luck. That's competence recognizing competence across a space small enough that deception wasn't viable. The conversation was interrupted by Zuri appearing in the doorway holding a bowl of cereal and a book about marine biology that she had checked out from the library. Did you know that octopuses have 3 hearts, and their blood is blue because it uses copper instead of iron? Victoria sat up against the headboard. I did not know that. How does the copper-based system work in cold water environments? Zuri launched into an explanation that incorporated technical terminology she had absorbed from reference materials designed for audiences significantly older than 10. Elijah listened while she described oxygen transport mechanisms and metabolic efficiency and evolutionary adaptations that made cephalopods successful in habitats where other organisms struggled. The morning continued in ordinary ways that constituted the actual substance of lives worth remembering. Breakfast eaten together, dishes washed and dried, Zuri's backpack checked to ensure she had completed homework and packed materials for classes that would teach her things she did not yet know she needed to learn. Elijah and Victoria leaving for work at jobs that paid sufficient income to support 3 people comfortably, if not luxuriously. Dignity was not something the world handed you. It was something you carried into every room, whether that room was a basement workstation or a 40th floor boardroom or a kitchen where your daughter ate cereal while explaining marine biology. And love, when it came after loss, did not arrive with thunder or dramatic transformation. It arrived like black coffee placed without asking, quietly and precisely in the exact way you needed it, by someone who paid attention long before you thought anyone was watching.